they basically told him, right, the big meeting that they had in Frankfurt yesterday. The photos of them entering and exiting have circulated the web space, that they were told him that there's no continuation with Julian Nagelsmann and his Bennies, as they're called, because all of his assistant coaches are called Benjamin. And Rudi Völler, there's history, right? Rudi Völler, after 2004, when he was the national team coach, and after the horrific Euros, he stepped down on his own, and he had a long conversation with Julian Nagelsmann. There were speculations that he would, hang on to his position because he makes about 7 million euros a year, and if he gets fired, he would be entitled to that compensation, right? If he resigns, the negotiations about compensation are very different. At the end of the day, he did the quote-unquote right thing and offered his resignation to the DFB board. It's also a really big 180 turnaround from what he said right after the game against Paraguay, right, Stefan, where he basically stepped in front of the press and said, I want to continue until Euro 2028. I still feel I'm the right guy. He also said, and I don't directly quote here, that a few games and things will get better. I'm quite honest with you, Stefan. I've always been a really big Julian Nagelsmann fan. I still think that he is an excellent coach. I'm disappointed on how things have ultimately, especially over the last year, so worked out. His selections were rightfully criticized, and I sense that my first reaction too was like, this is a lost opportunity. But I too have to admit that I was really wrong, and I think there's no other way for him to resign at this point, because I think the public in Germany especially are just sick and tired of his face, and sick and tired of his team selections, and I think he hasn't just lost the room, but he's lost the nation.
I mean, I've got so many thoughts on this. I was going to go on like a full rant mode on social media about it. And I thought, no, do you know what? I'll save it for our subscribers on the main show.
Yeah.
Because 5 years ago, I would have just spent like 12 hours end to end on Twitter, and now we're in a different world where I'm trying to, the internet's different, social media is different, but also the discourse is hopefully different as well, where we have this lovely little corner of the internet where we can have these kind of nuanced conversations, I hope. I think I'm trying really hard, Manu, not to say I told you so. Because I remember...
You'd be right to say so.
Do you remember... I can't remember if we did this on air or if this was just our conversation. And as our subscribers will know, what happens in our WhatsApp chat and what happens on a podcast blurs very easily. But I remember when they appointed Nagelsmann, and I thought, why is he gone for it? I remember thinking, what does Nagelsmann get out of it? And I mean, I think you were right. Well, he can win the World Cup or the Euros with Germany. I think, obviously, from an emotional point of view, that should be the biggest thing that any German should want to do, is to either win the World Cup or the Euros as a player or as a head coach, or anything really. Just be part of that would be amazing. Because I'm not German, I immediately discounted that, or not discounted it, but I kind of downgraded it probably more than I should have done. And, I'm sure I don't know, there's not really any good Scottish managers, so I can't really draw the similar comparison, but say
Ferguson.
Yeah, but he's obviously well retired, but I think if say Andy Robertson in the next 10 years becomes a really highly rated Scottish manager and then decides to coach the Scotland national team, I probably would understand it to an extent, because as a Scot, I can understand it. So in hindsight, I obviously understand why you and most of the nation would say, yeah, why wouldn't he take that job? But I guess from a kind of very clinical, I would think, objective point of view, outside of when I took the emotion out of it, because it's not there really, I didn't really see the upside for Nagelsmann with this job, because yes, there is obviously a huge upside if he wins the Euros or World Cup. I just never thought he ever had the squad to do that. We've been doing this for a while. I've been covering German football for quite a while. There's been a lot of post-mortems since the defeat in the World Cup, and we've had a few. You and Matt obviously did the big show this week on what happened to Germany. We've discussed things on the WhatsApp chat, and I think you could probably make a pretty strong case that, at least I think I could, this is the worst, what we'd say, like, I know a Football Manager would call it like a national pool of players.
Mm-hmm.
I think the national pool of players for Germany is as low as it has been since I started covering German football, which is at least 15 years now, I think. So, and I don't think it was any better when Nagelsmann took over the job, to be honest. In fact, I would say it was a far harder situation because he was supposed to come in and bring in a lot of change that Hansi Flick obviously wasn't capable or refused to do. So with all that in hindsight, I could say, you know, haha, this is what I said would happen. But I don't feel like that, obviously, you know, because even though I'm not German, I do obviously have a huge amount of affinity for the country, aside from Scotland and, well, yeah, just Scotland, really, I would say, like the nation I would obviously support. I mean, if they got to a final with Poland, I'd maybe feel a little conflicted, but, you know, it's like that. Don't think that's going to happen anytime soon for either country. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like, so I think it's a mess. It's a complete mess. And I think the interesting thing about Nagelsmann and what's kind of came out from all his tenure at the German national team, and I think it does echo a lot with what happened at Bayern, in the sense that I think he struggled with the limelight at Bayern, and I think he struggled with it at Germany as well. And I don't mean in the sense that like he's been nervous or he's been reluctant to do media or anything like that. I just think he has a personality type and a look which shouldn't matter, but I think it does, that makes it hard for him to convince people that he's on top of things, you know? And I mean, we're obviously going to draw comparisons to Jurgen Klopp on this podcast, and I'll hold off on that just yet, but I think I was kind of thinking about this over the course of the World Cup, and I do kind of wonder if I wonder if you could draw a graph between like, on like a line graph, and on one end you've got like the relative success of Julian Nagelsmann as a head coach, and it starts at the very top because he obviously bursts onto the scene with Hoffenheim and then RB Leipzig, and he's doing very well, goes to Bayern, to Germany, and it's just kind of going downwards. And then another line showing like how much designer outfits he wears, and it's going the opposite way because it feels like he was the ultimate laptop manager. He was the dork. He was the geek. He was the guy who was here to say, actually, other people can be managers except for kind of fancy head coaches who have household names. And I feel like maybe he's lost that to an extent. I don't want to say charm, because I don't think it was ever charm, but he's like a dork pretending to be a cool guy. And I don't think it really works for him. I know this is a really mean thing to say about anyone, especially someone who looks like me, who's by no means, you know, Brad Pitt. I think I guess what I'm trying to say is he doesn't look comfortable in his own skin or in his own outfits, you know, and I think we saw that at Bayern and we saw it at Germany, and it just comes off a wee bit like, I don't know, maybe it just kind of comes off a wee bit fake in the sense that he's trying to build, like the whole stuff with him changing his top at half time and all these, I made a joke on social media that he's kind of got the same stylist as like Mark Zuckerberg, where he wears all these kind of like toned colored, I mean, I guess I'm wearing something similar, but like a toned shirts and like it's all designer outfits, and it just doesn't feel like that's not who Julian Nagelsmann is to me. He's the guy who should just be wearing something stupid, looking like he should be working in a chemist somewhere, but gets the job done. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that he never really convinced me that he was in charge of that situation, as similarly to the Bayern Munich situation. And that's above and over and above like his player selections, his tactics, and everything else, I suppose.
Can I just put a little bit of nuance into this? I mostly agree with what you're saying. You know, I want to track that early Bayern Munich tenure as well. And I'm getting somewhere with this, so don't worry. I actually thought his first year at Bayern Munich was actually quite successful. He still had Robert Lewandowski there. You know, there was a team, there was a structure. He also was then put in a situation, and I remember this really quite well. This was the tail end of COVID, right? Where many of the Bayern bosses didn't speak, and this was under Oliver Kahn and Hassan Salihamidzic. And when they spoke, they usually said something silly. And he was often put in this position, and back then he was still like in his mid-30s, right? He's only 38 now. We have to remember that too, where he became increasingly overwhelmed, and then started hiding in his own shell, became very kind of unapproachable, almost nasty to an extent. Remember the thing with the firefighters where he had to apologize to a fire department in Munich and that sort of stuff. Then he gets fired, and that turned out to be a mistake. I think we very much have to remember that turned out to be a mistake, and it led to 2 years that were an absolute disaster for Bayern Munich. So that's not completely, I think that nuance needs to exist. Then he takes the Germany job. There's a lot of enthusiasm. Me, like many people, get swept away, right? And I think, now there's this young guy coming in. He's going to bring and field young players. He's going to change the way we play. And he does a lot of these things. There's minor setbacks, like the Austria-Turkey game come to mind, but, he goes into the Euros. He convinces Toni Kroos to come back, and he develops a tactical setup that works. For that approach, it worked. There's the early exit in the Euros, which I still maintain to this day is very unfortunate. Then there's the game against, then there's the UEFA Nations League, where they reach the finals and they play really good football too, until they meet big teams, right? And then at that point, where they lose the Nations League, where they finish fourth, and get outclassed by teams that are just a category above Germany right now. And I mean, this is part of the truth. He starts doing the same thing happens to him again as it did with Bayern towards the tail end years. It keeps growing and growing and growing, right? They lose to Slovakia. At the end of the day, they still managed to qualify quite easily. In fact, they finally did something that they haven't done in years, which is a winning streak for over 9 games, 10 games even, right? But the entire build-up to this World Cup was really odd, Stefan. The relying on players that were definitely above the zenith. Leroy Sané is one. Playing players out of position because he didn't have the tactical flexibility that we always lauded him to have. We thought he would be the guy to have that tactical flexibility, and yet he doesn't have it. Since then, other stories have emerged, right? He didn't even go to the United States to check out locations. Didier Deschamps is one coach who went over there several times. France played friendlies over there to check out the locality. Same with Thomas Tuchel, etc. Julian Nagelsmann didn't go to watch games live on locations in the Premier League and the Serie A to watch players who play there, right? Like, why is Jan Bissek not in this team? Probably because Julian Nagelsmann doesn't even know he's eligible to play for Germany. And so, these are tiny things where I'm thinking, like, there was one of the podcasts I listened to on the flight just now compared him to this really brilliant student who thinks he can get away with passing a test by doing all the necessary preparation for the test last second. And that's what this World Cup preparation felt like. I think he's a guy who's still at 38, needed to really proper fall on his face to learn that things do not just come to you because you're a boy genius. And I think that has finally happened to him. And I think that's very disappointing. I think he's still going to get a job, no problem. Someone is going to take a chance on him because he's still very young. But I think for him, this hopefully for him is going to be a really big learning process, because I think this is his biggest failure. He didn't understand. And I think that's not even really totally his fault, because again, he was put in a position at an age where he wasn't qualified to do so. What it means to be Bundestrainer in Germany. It's the position next to the Bundeskanzler. It's almost like being stately, right? And he didn't have that, especially towards the end of, like, the stuff with Undav, like the stuff with Sané, the stuff with Neuer, the way he treated Baumann is not befitting for someone who's holding one of the most important positions in the history of the German Federation since after World War II. Right? The people that were in charge of this position were successful. They were all stately. And towards the tail end, he was mostly just arrogant.
Yeah, he does kind of, this is largely my point as well, actually, in the sense that, like, this is what I'm saying, like, when he was at Hoffenheim and RB Leipzig, he had humility about him.
Yeah.
He was up and coming, he still had a degree of point to prove, and it felt like once he was at Bayern, he was almost like this kind of boy wonder who or the cat that got the cream, or whatever the expression you want to use. And then he gets the German national team job, and it's a very similar situation. So yeah, he's going to have to go rebuild his career, just like Hansi Flick did. And, Hansi Flick's obviously doing very well at Barcelona, so that'll work. And yeah, look, he's 38, so I mean, like,
yeah,
he's going to be absolutely fine in that regard. He could literally do nothing for 10 years, and he'd only then be the age that most people start managing. So, he can go off to Tibet and become a monk for 10 years and, rebuild his personality. I don't know, but like, I suspect he probably won't do that. I suspect he'd probably end up in the Premier League before too long.
I would suggest he shouldn't. I think he should take a mid-table Bundesliga team.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. But, these guys aren't going to do that, are they? I mean, we were talking this week about Oliver Glasner moving to Nottingham Forest. As I said on social media, like, that's just going to be an absolute car crash. It's going to be a circus. Whereas, he could have probably picked up a decent team in Germany and kind of got back to things. But I suspect with Glasner, and it's similar the case with Nagelsmann, he'll look at Bundesliga and think, I've done that. I've proved myself. I'm on to something else. We'll see where he ends up.